This is a reading from The Diary of Jesus by Jean Aulagnier. February 21st, Monday. Jesus and his apostles, except for John, set off for the lakeshore, drawing a crowd about them. By the time they neared the beach, a scribe had elbowed his way towards Jesus. Matthew chapter 8, verse 19b. Master, he said, I will follow you wherever you are going. But Jesus told him, Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air their resting places. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Wherever I find spirits to teach, miseries to relieve, and sinners to redeem, that is my home. My home is the whole world. At that, Jesus gave him the opportunity to become a good disciple. A little further, Jesus did what he had done to Philip. He said to a tall, husky young man, Follow me. At first the young man was too surprised to answer. Then he said, Matthew chapter 8, verse 21b, Lord, give me leave to go home and bury my father before I come. But to him Jesus said, Do follow me, and leave the dead to bury their dead. Lift up your eyes to the kingdom, Jesus went on. You shall see that your Father is an incorruptible pearl there. God calls, but keeps going his way. Come now. Come and proclaim the kingdom of God. At this, the man who was from Chorazin made up his mind. He handed his parcels to his companion and left with Jesus. They all went aboard and boated to Bethsaida. Other boats came along. The master had entered Peter's house. He saw that Peter's wife was back home. She had had enough with her mother's comments about her husband. They came back out, and Jesus sat in the boat, and Peter pulled a little offshore. There was a crowd on the beach. Jesus explained to them that not everybody is equally ready. He told them the parable of the sower. Let us read Matthew's account. Matthew chapter 13, verse 1. That day, leaving the house, Jesus had sat down by the seashore, and a great crowd gathered about him, so that he went on board a ship, and sat there instead, while the whole crowd remained standing on the beach. And he spoke to them long in parables. Here, he began, is the sower gone out to sow. And as he sowed, there were grains that fell beside the path, so that all the birds came and ate them up. And others fell on rocky ground, where the soil was shallow. They sprang up all at once, because they had not sunk deep into the ground. But as soon as the sun rose, they were parched. They had taken no root, and so they withered away. Some fell among briars, so that the briars grew up and smothered them. But others fell where the soil was good, and these yielded a harvest, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Listen, you that have ears to hear with. Then Jesus turned to Peter and said to him, Go up the river as far as you can, and land on the other side. Bethsaida was on the east bank of the Jordan's mouth. Jesus wanted to do something for the disciple who had followed him instead of attending his Father's funeral. God indeed always responds with goodness to every loving impulse. They disembarked near Chorazin and walked the rest of the way through the fields. 2 more months, Judas said, and the wheat will be ready for harvest. Footnote 10. See note 7 of this chapter. Jesus accompanied the young man to his family tomb and to his mother's house. After this, they returned to Bethsaida. After supper at Peter's, the apostles told Jesus that they were afraid they could not do everything he expected them to do. Jesus reassured them. Then they brought up the topic of parables. They asked Jesus, Matthew chapter 13, verse 10b, Why do you speak to them in parables? Because, he answered, it is granted to you to understand the mysteries of God's kingdom, but not to these others. If a man is spiritually rich, gifts will be made to him, and his riches will abound. If he is spiritually poor, even the little faith he has will be taken from him. And if I talk to them in parables, it is because though they have eyes, they cannot see, and though they have ears, they cannot hear or understand. Indeed, in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled. You will listen and listen, for you there is no understanding. You will watch and watch, for you there is no perceiving. The heart of this people has become dull. Their ears are slow to listen, and they keep their eyes shut, so that they may never see with those eyes, or hear with those ears, or understand with that heart, and turn back to me, and win healing from me. But blessed are your eyes, for they have sight. Blessed are your ears, for they have hearing. And believe me, there have been many prophets and just men who have longed to see what you see, and never saw it, to hear what you hear, and never heard it. These men were consumed by the desire to understand the mystery of prophecies, but as soon as the light of prophecy was put out, the words remained as dead coals, even for the saints who received them. Matthew 13, verse 18. The parable of the sower, then, is for your hearing. Wherever a man hears the word by which the kingdom is preached, but does not grasp it, the evil one comes and carries off what was sown in his heart. This is the one who received the seed by the wayside. The man who took in the seed in rocky ground is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but there is no root in him, and he does not last long. No sooner does tribulation or persecution arise over the word than his faith is shaken. And the man who took in the seed in the midst of briars is the man who hears the word, but allows the cares of this world and the false charms of riches to stifle it, so that he becomes fruitless. But the one who took in the seed in good soil is the one who both hears and grasps it. Such people are fruitful, one grain yielding 100-fold, one 60-fold, one 30-fold. Jesus had hardly finished speaking when there was a loud knock at the door. John raced in, visibly upset. John had left them on the way down from the mountain to accompany the women as well as Isaac and Timon, the ex-chief of the synagogue of Clearwater. They were off to Bethany via Enon, so that Holy Mary could see John the Baptist. She was, however, unable to see him. He had just been betrayed and delivered up to Antipas's soldiers. Those who had masterminded this were the Pharisees of Capernaum. The ringleader was Eli, whose grandson Jesus had healed. Upon learning all this from John, Jesus went out to pray by himself under the olive trees. The apostles began to be worried, because he too might be taken. February 22nd, Tuesday. Peter told Jesus that he wanted to go to Capernaum with Philip, Bartholomew, and Simon the Zealot to see if any traps had been planned for Jesus. Jesus knew it was not necessary, but let them go anyway. After this, Jesus and the other apostles went back to Chorazin, to the house of his new disciple, Eli, the one who had not buried his father. Jesus healed a girl and began preaching in Eli's garden behind the house. In this beautiful time of the year, Jesus said, wheat kernels are filling in, so I want to tell you a parable about wheat. Listen. He told them the parable of the wheat and the darnel. Matthew chapter 13, verse 24b. Here is an image, he said, of the kingdom of heaven. There was a man who sowed his field with clean seed, but while everyone was asleep, an enemy of his came and scattered darnel among the wheat, and went his way. So when the blade had sprung up and came into ear, the darnel too came to light. The farmer's men went to him and said, Sir, was it not clean seed you sowed in your field? How come then that there is darnel in it? He said, An enemy has done it. And his men asked him, Do you want us then to go and gather it up? But he said, No. Perhaps while you are gathering the darnel, you will root up the wheat with it. Leave them to grow side by side till harvest. And when harvest time comes, I will give the word to the reapers. Gather up the darnel first, and tie it in bundles to be burned, and store the wheat in my barn. Think now, Jesus said, how often has the enemy sown in your hearts? How much has he sown? After the crowd slowly dispersed, Jesus gave a fuller explanation to his apostles and Eli and his family. This is what the parable means. Matthew chapter 13, verse 37b. The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. The clean seed are the children of the kingdom, and the darnel is the children of the wicked one. The enemy that has sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the world. It is reaped by the angels. The darnel was gathered together and burned in the fire, and so it will be when the world is brought to an end. The Son of Man will give charge to his angels, and they will gather up all that gives offense in his kingdom, all those who do wickedly in it, and will cast them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then at last the just will shine out, clear as the sun, in their Father's kingdom. Listen, you that have ears to hear with. That is what the parable means for everybody, but for you, it also means something else. You have been wondering, especially since last night, if there might be traitors among my disciples, and you quiver for fear in your hearts. Yes, there are traitors. The sower sows good seed. That is, he chooses his disciples, or rather, each disciple is like a field, chosen to be part of God's kingdom. The Master cultivates them painstakingly, with love and wisdom. He can see their bad tendencies, but he has hope, and strengthens his hope with prayer and penance, so as to bring them to perfection. But the fields lie open to all the world's poisons, and Satan gets there first, and the passions of the world next. A master might foresee that a disciple will cause his death, yet he will not get rid of him. That would be pointless, because the ex-disciple would still be his enemy, and would even become worse. So the holy man prays and surrenders himself to God. He says, "Let your will be done." He knows that God himself will separate the evil Darnel from the harvest when the time comes. They spent the night at Eli's home. February 23rd, Wednesday. Peter and the other three returned from Capernaum in the morning and reported that everything was safe. By now, however, Jesus wanted to go to Magdala. So they did not go through Capernaum. They left Chorazin and headed west through the countryside. They ran into shepherds driving their flocks to the mountains, and Jesus spoke to them. He said that even though they lived by themselves, away from Jerusalem, if they practiced the 10 commandments of the law, they would be holy. They would really belong to God and not to the devil. After this, Jesus and his apostles went their way. They walked for a few hours and stopped for lunch. They had drifted to the southwest, so at a crossroads they went back east towards the Sea of Galilee. Then they turned a little north and made it to Magdala, north of Tiberias. Jesus walked over to Mary of Magdala's residence, where a man had just been stabbed. Jesus had him carried to his mother's house, about 100 yards away. Then he healed him. Mary of Magdala saw everything and seemed unmoved, but it was just a facade. Jesus told Peter not to insult her, but to pray for her. After this, they walked over to a house in the poorer section of town. Jesus compared his words to seeds, which he sows in people's hearts. He said that it was difficult for fragile seeds to grow if hearts were wild and hard. He also described the many stages of growth of those seeds. Then he compared love to a seed. Matthew 13, verse 31b. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like a grain of mustard seed that a man has taken and sowed in his field. Of all seeds, none is so little, but when it grows up, it is greater than any garden herb and gives a great deal of fruit. It grows into a tree, so that all the birds come and settle in its branches. February 24th to March 16th. Jesus and his apostles traveled far and wide around the lake. They did not begrudge their efforts to evangelize more and more. Jesus calmed the storm during this time. Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. So he took ship, and his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great storm arose on the Sea of Galilee, so that the waves rose high over the ship. But he lay asleep. And his disciples came and roused him, crying, "Lord, save us, we are sinking." But Jesus said to them, "Why are you faint-hearted, men of little faith?" Then he rose up and checked the winds and the sea, and there was a deep calm. Jesus told Maria Valtorta that all this happened because the 4 fishermen were too proud of being good sailors. He wanted to teach them a lesson in humility. As soon as Peter called upon him, Jesus showed himself as the Savior that he is, because he always responds to those who call upon him. March 16th, Thursday. Jesus and his apostles boated to the southeast of the Sea of Galilee. They walked towards Gamala, a town built on a mountain spur, and where some of the people lived in caves. Matthew chapter 8, verse 28. So he reached the other shore, in the country of the Gadarenes. Footnote 11. Some Greek manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel say Gadarenes, some Gerasenes, and others Gergesenes. The confusion is understandable, since there were 3 towns with similar names, all located in the same general area: Gadara, Gergesa, and Gerasha. These were found east of the Jordan and north of the Yabok River. See map on page 357. Yabok is also spelled Jabok. Maria Valtorta's writings solve the problem. She makes it clear that 1. That the exorcism took place near Gamala, which is somewhere between Gergesa to the north and Gadara to the southeast, and 2. And that one of the 2 men who were exorcised was from Gerasha, further south. Editor. And here he was met by 2 men possessed with devils, who came out of the rock tombs. They were so exceedingly fierce that none could pass along that road. And at once they cried aloud, "Why do you meddle with us, Jesus, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the appointed time?" Jesus asked the demon who possessed them. Luke chapter 8, verse 30b. "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion, for there were many devils that had entered into them." And they entreated him not to command them go back to the abyss. There was a great herd of swine feeding on the mountainside, and the devils besought his leave to go into these instead. And he let them. So the devils left the men and entered into the swine. Immediately the herd rushed down the cliff into the lake and were drowned. Matthew chapter 8, verse 33. The swineherds fled to the city, and there told all that had happened and the story of those who had been possessed. Immediately all the townspeople went out to meet Jesus, and when they found him, they entreated him to leave their country. Now the man through whom the demons had spoken, Luke chapter 8, verse 38b, asked leave to accompany Jesus, but he sent him away. "Go back home," he said, "and make known all the great things God has done to you." He went back and proclaimed throughout the whole city the great things Jesus had done for him. Jesus and his apostles sailed away. They went southwest to the Bay of Tarichea, and upon landing sent the boats back. Jesus led the way, happy to walk in the greenery. He headed southwest towards Mount Tabor. This was the beginning of his second Passover pilgrimage since the dawn of his public ministry. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus intended to bypass Endor, go through Naim, and stop in Esdraelon. Footnote 12. The plain of Esdraelon lies southeast of Mount Carmel. Today it is called the plain of Yisrael, which is sometimes spelled Jezreel. To see Doris's unhappy servants. They spent the night on the slopes of Mount Tabor. March 17th, Friday. As it turned out, they actually went through Endor. It was a poor village that clung on a mountain spur, a few miles southwest from Mount Tabor. Judas eagerly wanted to go there, since that was where King Saul had consulted a witch. See 1 Samuel chapter 28. They found a guide who would take them up to the witch's cave. On their way up, the guide admitted to Jesus that when he was young, he had stabbed a Roman during a fight. He had escaped from a hard labor camp, but ever since had been a prisoner of his memories and was filled with hatred. Jesus told him who he was and comforted him in his distress. The man cried. Then they arrived at the cave which Judas wanted to see. They found that Judas had unwittingly been tempted by the devil to find a bit of magic there for the sake of Jesus, he said. Jesus replied, "Eve picked from the forbidden tree, and God chased them from paradise. Saul bothered Samuel when he asked the witch to evoke him, and the Lord withdrew from Saul. My son, do not stretch out your hand to the forbidden fruit. Beware of Satan's poison. Only God must be welcomed with holy faith." Their guide was still there when they came out of the cave. He asked Jesus to help him come out of his spiritual death. Jesus accepted him as a new disciple and called him John. Then they left for Naim, and some villagers from Endor followed them. Naim was a fairly important town. It was built on a beautiful low hill overlooking the great plain of Esdraelon. Jesus was to strike a great blow there. For the first time, he called a dead person back to life. Luke chapter 7, verse 12. And just as he drew near the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out to his burial. He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a crowd of folk from the city went with her. When the Lord saw her, he had pity on her and said, "Do not weep." Then he went up and put his hand on the bier, and those who were carrying it stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise up." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all overcome with awe, and said, praising God, "A great prophet has risen up among us. God has visited his people." And this story of him was heralded throughout the whole of Judea and all the country round. Jesus wasted no time at Naim. Let us not forget that it was Friday. They only had a few hours left to make it to Esdraelon before the Sabbath began. They hurried on. Upon his arrival, Jesus immediately contacted the servants of both Jehochanan and Doris, son of Doris. Both were Pharisees. God's curse on Doris's field could readily be seen. See October 5th, AD 27, page 64.